Hi there. This is Smart Prosperity, the podcast, the video version for episode 24 on September 15th, 2021. Today, is climate change a ballot box issue? As a federal election looms, I'm speaking with David Coletto about Canadian attitudes towards climate change. David is co-founder and CEO of Abacus Data, one of Canada's leading polling and public opinion firms. He's been doing marketing research for more than a decade, and in his spare time, he's also professor in Carleton University's political management program. David, thanks for being on the show today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Eric.
I know it's busy times in the life of a pollster. How big an issue is climate change for Canadians in this election?
Well, it's certainly in the top issues this time around. There's a number of ways we measure it. When the campaign started, we had a question that said, here's a long list of issues. Tell us the top 5 that are going to drive your vote. And at the time, 42% of Canadians put it in their top 5 issues. More recently, we've kind of tried to really understand key ballot questions. And so we ask, what's the top 2 issues? And as of this weekend, 20% put it as their either first or second issue. So it is not by far the overwhelming top issue. There's no issue right now, actually, that does that. If any of them do, it's the cost of living. Right. But it is an issue of real concern. What's interesting, though, is who cares about this issue, right, and who's putting it as a priority. And I know we'll talk about the evolution of public opinion when it comes to climate change and concern about it. But it is one of the most politicized issues in the country, right? If you're a Liberal, a New Democrat, a Green Party supporter, even a Bloc supporter, you are far more likely to put it in your top basket of issues than if you were a Conservative supporter, right? Just to give you a sense, over a quarter of Liberal NDP supporters put climate change in their top 2 issues. Almost half of Green Party supporters put it in their top 2. Some would say, only half of Green Party supporters, but that's an interesting evidence of the quirkiness of the Green Party coalition. But only 7% of Conservatives put it in their top 2 issues. So that is, I think that gives some insight into the dynamics of this issue and how politicized it is. But if you look at the top issues, cost of living, climate change, healthcare, housing affordability, those are the top 4, and climate change is firmly in the minds of people as they think about this election and how they might vote.
Yeah, it's right up there. That's interesting. Last episode, we were speaking with Catherine Hayhoe, and she was talking about polarization in the United States, which, the polarization around climate change is famous, notorious rather. It sounds like that exists here in Canada based on kind of those split down party lines that you're describing. Besides the split down party lines, what can you say about, which Canadians this is a bigger issue for? I mean, are there regional discrepancies? Are there demographic discrepancies?
Yeah, there is. And we did some interesting research with the Institute for Climate Choices. We've done work with Clean Energy Canada on an ongoing basis. And if you ask the question differently and just say, how concerned are you about climate change? We do get 52%. So just over half say they're either extremely or quite concerned. But to your question about who, interestingly, younger Canadians under 30, the most likely to say they're either extremely or quite concerned about climate change. Okay. And interestingly, those over 60. So on either end of the kind of life cycle or age spectrum, you get higher levels of concern. Now, almost the majority of everybody across all ages are concerned about this, but you do see this really interesting dynamic where the younger and the older are signaling a greater depth of concern. We also see, particularly more recently, regions of the country that have been hit by extreme weather. So British Columbia, for example, much higher concern in BC about climate change. Atlantic Canada as well. Any community that's near a coastline seems to have a much more real appreciation for the impact it's having. And then there's this, unique Quebecers, also stand out as being more engaged, I think, and more aware and concerned about climate change. But those regional differences are there, but they're not severe, except for Alberta and Saskatchewan to some extent, which stand out as really the exceptions. Now, there's a lot of Albertans and there's a lot of folks in Saskatchewan who are worried about climate change. But it's just nowhere near the level that we see in neighboring provinces or other parts of the country.
You referred to, of course, some of those extreme weather events, the wildfires and the extreme heat that were experienced most acutely by people in British Columbia over the past 2 or 3 months. Has the priority, as Canadians have witnessed a number of these extreme weather events, some directly over the past few months, how big an impact do you think that has had on election priorities?
I think it's had some. It's certainly put it into focus for people, especially, this campaign is 5.5, 6 weeks long. And so it's a short campaign, but it's long in terms of the amount of issues and topics that get discussed. But headed into this election, there were, and I think there still are, but there were more serious fires going on in British Columbia. The Conservative leader took the Prime Minister to task for calling this election, and one reason he said was because of the wildfires that BC is going through. So I do think that live events, real events that people see with their own eyes, has the ability to not only make more people concerned about the issue, but pollsters often talk about issues in the context of issue salience, right? So on all those issues I mentioned earlier, vast majority of Canadians would say they're worried about those issues, but it's whether it's in focus, whether they are thinking about those issues as they assess the party platforms, as they assess the party leaders. And so this election started, I think, at a time when climate change was in people's minds. In many ways, the same happened in 2019 because you had the student protests happening right at the start of that, or just after that election, or just before that election started. And so these moments of time that capture people's attention can be really powerful, have a pretty powerful framing effect on what people think about. The challenge is that was 4.5 weeks ago. Today, you hear less about it, right? Because we've moved on. And the short attention span that both, I think, consumers of information have, as well as the media, as well as the parties, means that that issue, I don't think, has sustained itself as top of mind. But it's still there. People are still citing it as a top issue. It's just not. I don't know if any issue becomes a ballot question. But I don't necessarily think climate change for most people right now is a ballot box question. And
that's the ballot box question.
The ballot box question of this election, right?
Interesting. I was going to ask about that because I was looking at some polling that Environics had put out, looking at specific ridings that have above average concerns about climate change. And they narrowed it down to about 9 ridings in Canada where in their opinion, there could be it might be the ballot box question, but it sounds like for every other of the 338 ridings in Canada, as you say, it's not necessarily the ballot box question right now. Why do you think that is? Why, if we've had this summer of extreme weather, of extreme climate events, and, consistently Canadians have recently at least put it in kind of their top concerns, why is it not the ballot box question? Why is it not kind of more front of campaign right now for each of the parties vying for leadership in this government?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think these are more hypotheses than something I can really confirm with data, because it's complicated. But I think one of the reasons is because to a lot of voters, even those who care deeply about this issue, climate change has moved from being an issue that parties can easily respond to and differentiate themselves, versus an issue that becomes part of the broader assessment that you make of a political party, right? And so the reason I say that is, if you're somebody who cares deeply about climate change, it's highly unlikely you're even considering voting for the Conservative Party, right? That despite their best attempts to try to appear and maybe genuinely care about this issue, people who deeply care about it look at that party and say, you're the least likely to get my vote because out of all the parties that I have to choose from, you don't seem as ambitious or as you don't talk about it as much as I want you to. And so I automatically write you out. And then the second reason might be that, and this is the nature of politics, I think, is the parties will decide which issues they believe they can really differentiate themselves on. And as I've learned firsthand in doing research on climate change, it is full well too, a very complicated issue, right? It's not as easy to say, I'm going to make life more affordable by cutting your GST, right? And so competition on who can handle this issue best is far more nuanced. And so as much as I think the Liberals, for example, are trying to contrast themselves with the Conservatives on climate change, they're also competing with the New Democrats and the Greens and the Bloc to, be positioned as best on this issue. And yet voters don't really, I think, see a lot of distinction. And that, people who study this, people who care about climate change and the environment deeply can easily point to the differences between the party platforms, right? But the average person doesn't. And so they're using cues and heuristics to try to drive their thinking. And it's not something that's going to slap somebody in the face and get them to wake up and go vote. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but as much as it's frustrating to see in an environment where we have these extreme weather events, where there's more and more evidence every day that the world's heating up and it's having immense impact on our climate, people, it's almost like they basically are saying, yeah, I know, and that's baked into my support for party X, but it's not going to be the distinguishing feature that makes me choose them over someone else.
Okay. Yeah, and you said it, there are varying shades of green now in terms of the party platforms. It's not as black and white as it used to be. I think even, looking back to 2019, a lot has changed in terms of, particularly in terms of the Conservative Party platform, which has grown in terms of its climate credibility this time around. I want to tap into your insights that go many years back, but starting with just a comparison of election 43 and election 44, 2019 and this year. Have you seen much of an evolution in terms of the party posturing around climate change?
Well, I think you raise a really immense point, a really important point. In just 2 years, we've seen a almost seismic shift in the perception that people have about which party is best able to handle this issue. So back in 2019, we asked a question, which party is best able to handle, different issues. And in 2019, among those who cared about climate change, the Green Party led by 21 points over the Liberals. So there was like 40% picked the Greens and then 20% picked the Liberals, about that. Wow. Today, when we ask the exact same question, the Liberals are ahead by 15 over the Conservatives, and the Greens actually come fourth, right?
Wow.
So within a 2-year period, public perceptions, and you described the greening of all the parties in a way, that's happened, and the Liberals have done an exceptionally good job at positioning themselves perceptually in the minds of voters, at least more voters, that they are the party of climate action.
Isn't that interesting?
Right? So for years, I went back in 2015, the Greens were ahead. In 2011, our first election we did polling on, the Greens were well ahead. Right? It was that one thing that the Greens could always count on that says, we're best on this issue. It's in our name, right? Like it's tied to their brand. Yeah. Well, you're seeing the challenges the Greens are having apart from their internal struggles, that they no longer, if you're a one issue party and you lose ownership of that issue,
you don't
then
even
what's
the
the
issue
point of you anymore, right? And so the Greens and the New Democrats, and to some extent, although I still don't, those who care deeply about this issue don't choose the Conservatives as the best on it, have in a way co-opted the Greens and have made climate change part of their platform and their identity as much as, Indigenous reconciliation or social justice issues for the NDP, or helping the middle class for the Liberal Party, right? It's now become part of that. And I think when you ask people who is the leader, that most cares deeply about climate change, Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, the Liberal leader, is very high up on that list. Even though I know lots of environmentalists who would say he has not done enough in the 6 years he's been in power. So that's the power of communications and framing and branding that often has nothing to do with reality. It's in fact the perception that really drives this. And so that shift has happened in a very short period of time.
That is so interesting. And now I want to go back even further now, because, I think, 10 years ago, this is what every environmentalist wanted, this kind of election, where you had varying shades of green, and, varying levels of high ambition. Although some would say that, what we're seeing in all the campaign platforms is still not enough, but still, compared to 10 years ago, we're in a different kind of stratosphere. What has, first of all, just based on the polling that you've done and the public opinion research that you've done over the past 7 years, that I've been following it, how have you seen the evolution of Canadian attitudes with respect to climate change?
Well, let me take even a step farther back and go back to 2008. And that was probably the first federal election in which, at least in the early days, or just before it was called, the environment or climate change was at the top of the list, right? It was coming off Al Gore's, popularity around his book and then his documentary. And I think there was a real appreciation for environment as a top issue. And Stéphane Dion, the Liberal leader, brought out what at the time was a highly controversial and ambitious, green shift, right? Which now seems obvious and mainstream, but at the time was a pretty courageous thing to do. And then soon after, you had the recession that hit, and the environment was completely wiped off as a top issue, and people's focus became the economy and jobs and their livelihoods. Since then, I think the environment has consistently been, at given periods, at given moments throughout the last, it's like 13 years, a top issue, right? It's become cemented. But as I think about public opinion, I wonder if that is actually, as much as, more and more people say they believe climate change is real, they want action, they describe it as an emergency. There's lots of, we did some really interesting research for Seth Klein's book. We wrote about mobilizing like we should for war, and people bought into that concept pretty broadly. But it's almost like we've become so used to talking about it that it no longer has value, right? It no longer is novel, and novel things are what, just like fashion goes out of fashion, so too do issues. And that's not to say that people don't care about it, but I think we always have to be reminded, unfortunately, with events that put this issue back onto our agenda. We can't just take it for granted, because then the parties can take it for granted, and they won't look to differentiate on it. So
right,
the outcome of more or less consensus among the political class that action's needed has meant that the differentiators within the public mind have been sort of scrubbed away. And so for environmentalists, for those who care deeply about this issue, it's a reminder you have to constantly keep the issue salient and find ways of keeping the public engaged, because other things will consume them.
That's interesting. I mean, in one way of looking at that is as a success for environmentalists and for people who care about climate change, because climate has become part of the wallpaper. It's become part of the furniture in the room. It's going to be in every platform, and for some might see it as a success, but as you're pointing out, for it to become kind of a differentiator, to become a ballot box issue, to become something that really drives how people vote, you need to have events that make it pop. It may be something like in 2019, how those student protests around the world, the Fridays for the Future protests, really kind of helped galvanize people's thinking and opinions around climate change.
And I'll just use another example. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic, and the global pandemic is not the top issue of this election, right? Like,
does that surprise you?
There. I mean, it does, but it also, I think, is maybe confirms my thesis or my theory that we've become exhausted talking about it, right? We don't want to talk about it anymore. So let's talk about the things now. I mean, every issue we're talking about is related to the pandemic. So inflation is being driven by the pandemic. Housing prices are going through the roof because of the pandemic. We're worried about our health system because of the pandemic.
Okay.
And so there's a lesson there for climate activists and those who want to push the agenda is, and you're starting to see it, because I work with a lot of organizations, you have to extend the reach of the climate crisis beyond the climate crisis, right? You have to start talking about the health effects of climate change. You have to make it real and put it in connection to people's everyday lives in order to make it then politically relevant. And so I think the work is being done there, right? More and more research being done, more and more effort to show that the air quality is being affected. The extreme weather events were not just about forest fires, it was about people dying because in BC, they couldn't find a cool place to go, right? Those are those moments where the moment people actually feel their personal well-being is directly going to be affected by a problem is when they then ask for a political solution. And I think we're getting closer to there. And that once that happens, then you will get, that you hit that tipping point in which politicians have to respond. They have to offer solutions and be seen as caring deeply about this issue. I think we're not far from a place, and I think the Conservative campaign has signaled it, where you cannot be elected Prime Minister of Canada if you are not bilingual and if you don't believe clearly that climate change is an existential crisis. I don't think we're far off from that. And in the same way that you can't also be, and in the same way you can't be, not for Canada's public healthcare system. That it's going to become one of those, issues that can disqualify you from the top job. It doesn't necessarily though qualify you for it, right? And that's where the work has to constantly happen to push for more action and more aggressive policy choices.
I want to touch down on the Conservatives quickly, because there has been this, people of millennials maybe associate the Conservatives with the Stephen Harper era and kind of the pulling out of Kyoto Protocol and kind of the reputation that the Harper government set around climate change. More recently, people might associate the Conservatives with Andrew Scheer, who basically ran the 2019 campaign against the carbon price. And then there's been this about face, I think, based partly on some polling that showed that a lot of that mushy middle in Canada does care about climate change, would support a carbon price, and sure enough, back in the spring, Erin O'Toole released a platform that includes carbon pricing. How close? I mean, I'm just wondering about your thoughts on this transformation, because it's maybe been one of the more striking of between elections 43 and election 44. But also, can that be? Do you think that has staying power within the Conservative Party, or come election 45, are we going to see a whole other approach on climate change and the environment?
Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff to debate, and I'm not the policy expert on what their plan is, and is it truly credible? But I think they still have a lot of work to do if they think that people who care about this issue will take them seriously on it. But what they might have done, at least the first step, and this is a purely political move, is to use a COVID pun here, inoculate themselves from that criticism, right? And so you may not think they're the best on the issue, but they're acceptable. They won't take us too far back. I think is basically how they're basically positioning themselves. Like even their emissions target is a step back, but do people feel it's too big a step back? I don't think is harmful enough to diminish their prospects of winning.
Yeah.
But the Conservative Party faces a deeper problem, I think, politically, in that as long as a sizable portion of their caucus are Albertans and Saskatchewan MPs, they're always going to have this internal tension between, actually putting out policy and talking about climate change regularly versus only notionally, greenwashing their platform and trying to appear to care about that issue. And that is going to be a constant internal struggle they're going to face as long as their base and their anchor is I'm not going to call Western Canada, is Prairie Canada, right? Because BC is moving in a very different direction, particularly coastal BC, than Alberta and Saskatchewan are. And so I think that's going to be a long-term challenge for them, right? You saw the internal strife around their convention earlier this year. Members not wanting to even vote for a motion that says climate change is real, and the politics internally about that. I don't know if they'll ever take a step back away from the progress they've made on the issue, but I still am hesitant to see them being able to adopt a platform that's more aggressive, like say the British Conservative Party, or the German Conservative Party, who live in countries, frankly, that don't have major energy sectors that are at the core of that political party's identity. So I think for as long as we produce a lot of oil and gas, there will always be a political party to represent their interests. And right now that is the Conservative Party. And I don't see that changing given their geographic base.
One poll, and maybe I'll end on this one. One poll that I was consulting of yours from back in June was this question around the link between climate change and climate action and the economy. And it seems like there's been this kind of, an about face where people who, the old narrative out there was that taking action on climate change is going to hurt our economy. Actually, your June poll found the opposite, that the vast majority of people, the vast majority of Canadians felt that taking action on climate change will actually be good for the economy. Is that a frame and an understanding that you think is going to stick with the Canadian public?
Absolutely. I think, as we watch around the world and other countries kind of accelerate their investments in clean technology, in transitioning to, zero emission vehicles and putting the infrastructure in place to make that happen, political leaders are going to be under pressure to show, what are you doing about it? How are you keeping pace? And so I do think there's been a fairly quick, fairly wholesale shift in the public's view that dealing with climate change is not costly. It's not a cost, right? It is actually potentially an advantage for us, and the opportunities are there. Not everybody's there, but even, we did some interesting work with an organization called Iron and Earth. We surveyed energy workers across the country, and even many who work in the oil and gas sector recognize that the transition is going to come, and we either embrace it because it's good for the planet and our own health, and embrace it for our economic long-term well-being. So I think continuing to highlight that, continuing to show that, the price of renewable energy has dropped substantially over the last 5 to 10 years, that it's almost, it's cheaper to put solar panels on your roof than it might be to build a new gas plant to power a number of homes in a community. That will continue to move people. And I think it's going to continue to make climate action. We may not even be talking about climate action in 5 years. Instead, it's just going to be, action, because everything is going to be done in the lens of, we have to make decisions that move us towards, social equity, economic growth, and, get us to net zero. And I don't think we're that far from seeing the language change pretty broadly, where people just assume that politicians and governments have to make decisions that meet those criteria.
Interesting, where climate policies are no longer presented as climate policies, but as economic policies, social policies, health and safety policies. That's fascinating. David, thank you so much for, just a few days out from an election. I know there's lots of people that are interested in what you're seeing in public opinion. So I appreciate you taking the time out to speak to me today.
You're welcome. Anytime I can talk about this issue, because it's, in my mind, the most important one too. So thanks for this great chat, Eric. Thanks.
There you go. That was David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data. For a link to some of his firm's most interesting public polling and research on climate change, in my opinion, we've curated some links at this episode's webpage at podcast.smartprosperity.ca. Now, the full podcast episode has more content, has a couple more segments. If you want to listen to that, again, go to podcast.smartprosperity.ca or wherever you stream your podcasts. Thanks.